Good afternoon. Welcome to the Midday Mull for Tuesday, the 6th of July. Continuing to follow Robert Murray McShane's readings, we read Joshua chapter 8, which is a passage that one of those that I rather wasn't there, that we didn't have to try and get our heads around because it doesn't happen easily. We read in verse 25, 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back the hand that held out his javelin until he had destroyed all who lived in Ai. Now, those kind of historical facts we can entirely believe because we've seen it throughout history. Human beings are not nice people. And we see this kind of atrocity happening time and again. Even today, you look at what's going on in Ethiopia, and we see similar kind of behavior. So the fact that it happened is entirely likely. The problem is that we read this and it seems like God did nothing, and worse than that, almost that God instigated it. How do we deal with that? Now, the one way is to say, well, clearly God wouldn't do that. My God's a nice, kind, loving, generous, compassionate God. He'd never command anybody to do that kind of thing. The fact that Joshua thought he'd been commanded, he was wrong. God didn't do that. This is not what God said. They got it wrong, which solves the problem. Except that when somebody comes to you and says, God said love your enemies, that's complete nonsense. God wouldn't want you to love your enemies. He wants you the best for you. He'll want your enemies to be destroyed. That's what God would want for your enemies. Whoever says this, love your enemies, that's complete nonsense. God would never say that. And how do you decide what God does say and doesn't say once you start picking and choosing? And you end up creating an intellectual idol, creating a God that I like, that fits with my preferences and my ideas, rather than a God that reveals himself in Scripture. So it's a slippery path that if you're going to pick and choose your scriptures because, oh my goodness, you've no grounds to stand on then. So how do we make sense of this if God did say it? I believe that there are two aspects, and this is a very superficial analysis, and there's so much more that could be said. The one is, when God gives us freedom of choice, do we actually have full freedom? If I choose to turn my back on God, walk away from him, have nothing to do with him, does God respect my choice? Not only throughout my life, but throughout my existence. Does God respect my choice into eternity, that I will have turned my back and be separated from God forever? Or will God circle around and stop? No, I didn't really give you that kind of freedom. I'm going to take over. You haven't got the choice. You're coming back this way. Scripture tells us, no, God does give us that freedom. We do have the freedom to choose, even if it's going to separate us from God for eternity. Even if our choice to live our lives our way, to embrace wickedness and evil, will lead ultimately to our eternal destruction, God respects our choice. And so evil is punished. And when the Israelites went into the land of Canaan, they were God's agents punishing the evil of those communities. If we go back to Genesis chapter 15, God speaking to Abraham says, this land will be yours, but not now. He says, your descendants will go into Egypt, where they will be enslaved for a while, and then they will come back. In verse 16 of chapter 15, he says, in the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So God is saying, that, as I read it, that they are continuing on a journey of sin which will be punished in the future in 4 generations' time. And so as the Israelites came and took over the promised land and destroyed the city of Ai and the people within it, this was part of God's judgment on their sin. And certainly if we look through the rest of the Old Testament, we see that where the Israelites had interactions with and embraced the surrounding nations, they ended up in all sorts of abominations, including human sacrificing their children to false gods. These were not nice cultures. These were not nice societies. They deserved judgment. And so as I read it, I see this not as an expansionist greedy land grab, but as people being used in God's plan to bring judgment on sin that deserved it. Now, there's a lot more that can be said, and many people might disagree with my understanding. You're free to read it, make your own mind up, but I end up saying we've got to hold on to what we see in Scripture and try and make sense from within Scripture without ditching any of it. So I pray that God would lead you and guide you closer to Him into a deeper understanding as we wrestle with passages that sometimes leave us puzzled, confused, and a little uncertain. So be encouraged as you do that and know God's guidance and blessing.